Hello and welcome. This is Wilrens for Create a Learning Site, the place to go deeper in your understanding of the Bible. I start off with a quotation by William Lane Craig. Those who think about time are thinking deeply. Those who think about God are thinking even more deeply still. Those who try to think about God and time are pressing the very limits of human understanding. Indeed, I can speak from experience now. Craig's statement is true. I've been on a learning journey for several months, reading and thinking about these questions, and now it's time to report. I would like to map out the basic options together with the most important issues we need to consider. In the next issue, I hope to write about foreknowledge. Does God foreknow the future? This controversial question is what made me think about time to begin with. It hardly makes sense to write about foreknowledge or speak about foreknowledge without first thinking about time and God's relationship with time. And so what I write this month is meant as a foundation for next month's issue, although it's also a topic in its own right. It makes for a long issue, but I'm not going to cut it short. I'm quite excited about what I have been learning. I'm going to spread it out over 2 separate videos, so it's not too long. Here we go. The basic question is, what does it mean to say that God is eternal? There are at least 2 different answers. One is that God exists for an infinite duration. He has no end, and neither did he have a beginning. On this understanding, eternity simply means endless duration. God is everlasting. The alternative answer claims that eternity is something more and something different. Eternity is not so much about quantity as it is about quality. There is a qualitative difference between time and eternity. A different way to put this is that either God exists in time, so that he is temporal, or God is timeless. Or atemporal. And of course, then the question becomes, what does that mean? Obviously, this also brings up the question of time itself. What is it? No doubt you expect me to turn to the Bible now in search of an answer. Unfortunately, the relevant material is somewhat inconclusive. In part, the problem has to do with our nature as humans and therefore temporal beings. We always experience God's actions as taking place within time. But does that mean that God himself is in time and therefore temporal? Not necessarily. There's simply no other way for us to experience him. Since we are temporal, and there's no other mode of existence open to us, God always appears temporal to us as well. But this does not suffice as an argument that God is indeed temporal. Obviously, in the Bible, God is eternal in the sense that he has no beginning and he has no end. Is there more we can say? Well, William Lane Craig discusses several Bible verses that may hint at God's existence before time. Genesis 1, verse 1, and Proverbs chapter 8, verse 22 and following, can be taken to mean that time had a beginning, that there was a first moment for time, not for God, of course. Then there's Jude, verse 25, which ascribes glory and authority to God before all time. and now and forever. Well, this is as clear as it gets. It suggests God existed before time and therefore is himself not in time. Notice, by the way, how difficult it is for us to get away from temporal language. If time had a beginning, there is no before time. There may be something beyond time, but not before it. Well, then we have verses like Titus 1, verse 23, 2 Timothy 1, verse 9, and 1 Corinthians 2, verse 7, all of which sort of imply that there is something before or beyond the beginning of time. However, for those of us who are already convinced that God exists in time and is temporal, these verses will hardly be sufficient to make us change our mind. The reason is we hold such beliefs as part of a larger system of ideas and arguments, together with biblical interpretations, and not as a single independent belief. This is true for many larger controversial issues, ranging from child baptism and predestination or free will, to women in leadership, and the correct understanding of the millennium in Revelation 20, to mention a few. In those contexts, it never works to quote a few Bible verses to settle the issue. If there are any problem verses for a position, answers and explanations have been developed and long since been integrated into the system to maintain its coherence. Our opponent is unlikely to be swayed or impressed by an array of Bible verses. And it's the same here. If we want to progress in our understanding of God and time, we need to venture beyond the Bible into the realm of philosophy and to a lesser extent, physics. I will start with physics. What can it tell us about time? Well, some argue that time is an illusion, a mere subjective experience, and not a real feature. What is real, in this view, is change. There exists a sequence with underlying cause and effect relationships. This leaves us, humans, with the impression of something we call time. Now, I don't think this is likely to be true. Already the physics of motion seem to imply that time is a real feature of the universe. Albert Einstein's famous formula E is mc squared is as foundational as it gets, and it includes c, the speed of light, which implies time, distance covered per second. It is possible that time is an inherent feature of the physical universe. And if that is the case, it must have begun with creation. According to the Big Bang theory, space, matter, and time came into existence simultaneously. This is t is 0. It suggests that God is not in time, for he precedes all of this. However, it's also possible that time is absolute after all. For this to be true, Einstein would have to be proven wrong about the relativity of time, and in that case, it may well have preceded the Big Bang, and God may have been in time all along after all. Some physicists speak of a space-time continuum, in which time is treated as a fourth dimension. It is different from length, breadth, and width, in that it moves in only one direction and cannot be traversed back and forth the way we move through space. Still, for certain purposes, it is a useful model in physics. However, it's probably only that, a model. Physicists use it to play, that is, to think about the universe, but most do not believe that it describes the way the universe really is. So, physics tells us that time may have had a beginning, and that nothing in physics precludes God from being timeless, but it does not prove this. Does philosophy have more to offer? Interestingly, so a little aside, a significant shift has taken place since the late 20th century. Up until the 1970s, a clear majority of Christian thinkers understood God's eternity as timelessness. This is no longer the case. The majority now argues that eternal means everlasting and indicates a duration of time. More on this in the next section. I first want to deal with some philosophical reflections on the nature of time itself. A distinction has been made between, on the one hand, a dynamic or process view of time, and on the other hand, a static or stasis view of time. Let me explain. In the dynamic view, time is understood as consisting of past, present, and future. However, of these three, only the present is real. The past no longer exists, it can only be remembered. The future does not yet exist. Therefore, really only the present moment has real existence. Humans experience time this way, it's therefore not hard to grasp. Of course, if the future is non-existent, the question arises if and how God could possibly foreknow it, a question to which I will return in the next issue. The static view holds that events are related to each other in terms of before and after, and on occasion also simultaneous. Time is very much like a timeline on which x exists before epsilon and z exists after epsilon and x. In this understanding, there is no now or present moment, therefore no movement from past to future. All moments exist simultaneously. The past still exists and the future already exists. This is a little harder to grasp. The static view is extremely counterintuitive because we do not experience time like this. It shows a certain similarity to the space-time continuum mentioned in the previous section, because there too all of time appears to exist simultaneously in the form of a fourth dimension. Now, for all its strangeness, this view offers at least one advantage. It becomes a little more understandable that God might know the future. After all, it already exists. And if God himself is outside of time, he may be in a perfect position to oversee all of time, and indeed know the end from the beginning, because it's there for him to see. There are disadvantages too, beyond it being strange. How does one avoid strict determinism in this model, or establish any sort of free will? And does it imply that time and therefore the universe are co-eternal with God, seeing all of it simply exists forever, does not come into being? Or did God bring all of it into being in an instant? But what would be the sense of this? Okay, now on to the big question. What can we say about God and time? I will start with what is often called classical theism, a view that found its first clear expression in the writings of church fathers like Augustine and Boethius. It dominated the Middle Ages. Its most profound articulation is found in the writings of Anselm of Canterbury and Thomas of Aquinas. It was by and large preserved by the Reformers and continued to dominate until well into the 20th century. I think this justifies making it my point of departure, and afterwards I will look at alternatives. In classical theism, God is understood to be outside of time and therefore timeless. He has no succession of moments. His mode of existence is entirely different from ours. Often reference is made to an eternal now in which all of time, past, present and future, is present to God and in which he experiences his entire being and existence. An early expression of this understanding puts it like this. Accordingly, that which includes and possesses the whole fullness of unending life at once, from which nothing future is absent, from which nothing past has escaped, this is rightly called eternal. This must of necessity be ever present to itself in full self-possession, and hold the infinity of movable time in an abiding present. Now, before we move on and look at its problematic sides, it may be worth pausing a moment to reread this statement, to reflect on the beauty of its vision of God. Classical theism presents us with an immeasurably great, supreme and exalted being, greater than whom no being can be conceived. I can understand that this kind of vision inspired the building of cathedrals. There are different ways to arrive at such an understanding of God. One approach starts with the idea of God's perfection. Since he is perfect, he cannot change. Any change would not be an improvement, but a loss. Therefore, God does not experience time. He does not change, and there is no succession of differentiated moments. After all, if God were in time, his past would be irretrievably lost to him. We all know the regret of things and people that are gone. Surely God, as a perfect being, does not live with such regrets, clouding his perfect joy. And if God were in time, he would have a future not yet in existence and would therefore be incomplete. He would continue to obtain new knowledge, and he would therefore as yet be imperfect. Now let's take a look at the difficulties that come with classical theism. First, logically, classical theism entails not just the immutability of God, the fact that he cannot change, but also the impassibility of God, which means that God cannot be affected by anything other than himself. He may not even have emotions, some argue, because this would imply change. Needless to say, this claim sits uneasy with the way the Bible portrays God as responsive, relational, and full of emotion. Such portrayals then have to be explained in classical theism as anthropomorphisms, speaking about God in human terms. Second, there's the problem of the timeless moment. It's difficult to grasp what eternal existence in a timeless sense means. That its defenders use phrases like a single eternal instant or the single moment of eternity does not help. It is not a contradiction to speak of the moment or instant of eternity. Third, there's the question whether God can be personal if he's timeless. There's some debate about this. What is a timeless God capable of? Now, obviously, he cannot deliberate with himself, think something through and come to a conclusion. He cannot truly remember or forget something, but he is able to know and will things timelessly. He could therefore still be a person. Problem number 4. Even if God knows everything about the past and the future, in classical theism, he won't know, assuming a dynamic view of time, which moment it is now. What of all he knows is presently happening? In other words, God doesn't know what time it is or what day is today. The reason is this: time and now are constantly changing. If God knows what time it is, his knowledge, and therefore God himself, would be constantly changing as well. He knows at 10 a.m. that it is 10 a.m. and at 1 minute past 10 he knows that it's 1 minute past 10. There would be a sequence, a succession of moments in God's knowledge, and therefore God would be in time. But if God is not in time and does not know which moment it is now, does that mean that God would not be omniscient? Problem number 5. What is timeless action? It's especially hard to see how a timeless God would interact with the created world. How could a timeless God have a real relationship with people and respond to them? There are elaborate attempts to answer such questions, but critics have generally rebuffed the answers as incoherent or even meaningless. How can a timelessly eternal God do or accomplish anything? Doesn't every form of action have a beginning, a process of execution, and an end? Because if it does, it takes time. We could argue that God timelessly initiates his actions and responses based on what he timelessly knows. These actions are then actualized, take place, become real, in the course of time, so the argument would go. But God does not himself act in time, in a timely fashion. He does all his actions eternally, without beginning or end, and in a sense all at once. I'm not sure if this makes sense. It remains hard to see how time and eternity could intersect. Perhaps this is easier in the static view of time, because in that case all of time exists simultaneously. Besides, there's no now, so God's omniscience is not diminished by not knowing what time it is. To borrow an illustration from C.S. Lewis, imagine a reader or author and his book. In the book, time is linear, and its characters experience the events one sentence at a time. But the reader is outside of the book. He is not bound by the linear order of the book, and all its content may be present to him simultaneously. However, this presupposes that the future already exists, which is far from obvious, and it appears to lead to strong determinism. The characters in the book may not be aware of it, but there's only one way the story can go. So, in conclusion, these 5 problems indicate that classical theism is struggling a bit to prove its coherence. Nevertheless, although the classical view has lost ground in recent decades, it was the overwhelmingly dominant view of the Church for almost its entire existence and is still held by significant numbers of philosophers and theologians. It is in many ways the starting point for the alternatives that we will look at in a separate video.
The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments.